Okay, well, good afternoon to everybody. I'm glad everybody could make it. I'm glad I made it today. Excuse me. Hopefully, everybody can hear me. If not, let me know. Just put something in the chat box, or just give me a shout out if you can't hear me. But, hopefully, you can. I want to first of all just apologize once again. I know that I got a number of emails from students about last week's class. The timing was very strange. This time last week, I was in the hospital and I had trouble breathing around noon. I just couldn't breathe and ended up having a respiratory infection. And they took me to the hospital and just pumped me full of IV antibiotics, and I was good in a couple of days. So very strange, very unusual. And had I had more time and it happened at 8 o'clock in the morning, I could have alerted somebody at the business school. They could have gotten with everybody and said, hey, we're not going to have class, we're going to do this or whatever. So but because that wasn't able to happen, unfortunately, we are where we are. So if you want to know where we are sort of situated in terms of the course material, all I did was simply push back everything I was going to do last week to this week. That includes last week's discussion. And so if you didn't do the week 8 discussion, we're in week 9 now, go ahead and do it. And you'll get credit for having done it in week 9, even though it was assigned for week 8. I just thought it was easier to do that rather than assign two discussion topics for the very same topic we're going to cover, one of which we didn't get to last time. So if you had already posted last week, then I'll just simply give everyone credit for week 9. So shouldn't be any difficulty there. You should be fine. Okay? I've got the transcription on, so hopefully everybody can read along if that helps you. My plan for today is to do this. We have been talking about economic thinking, and I remember we had slid a week in there to talk about Marx and Engels. That was, I think, around week 7, and that wasn't on the syllabus. It was an oversight on my part, but we went in and got that in there, and then we missed a week last week. So we're actually operating on the classical and / neoclassical theory this week today. So that's what we're going to cover. I don't think we're going to get through it all, because what I want to do, I want to give myself about a half an hour. So around 15 till, I want to talk about the exam itself and what to expect on that. And the exam will be available on Friday for you to take. If I can make it available sooner, I will. I'm still sort of preparing the exam itself. And I didn't really know how far I was going to get in talking about some of the classical school material, quite frankly. So what I need to do is sort of find out how far we get, and then just kind of take it from there. If there's something I don't get to, then I won't cover it on the exam. And if I do, for whatever reason, cover it, and you feel free to call me out and say, hey, we didn't talk about it. And my philosophy in this class particularly is to never have an exam question or quiz question even that deals with something that we don't talk about in class. And that's sort of your reward for coming to class, is to be able to hear some of that material and I know the textbook itself is probably not as useful. I realize that. This week, however, probably is, because there's a lot of economic theory that we're going to talk about. We talked a bit about the Keynesian theory before. That was the last topic we talked about. Now we're going to sort of work our way into talking about classical theory, which we only just introduced a couple of weeks ago. So let's do that. And again, whatever we don't get to today, I will simply make it a point to sort of cut off our discussion and then begin when we come back from our exam. And the exam itself, and I'll talk more about the exam as we get a bit closer here, but the exam itself is going to only cover the material up to, and we've talked about up to today's class, okay? And then if there's any carryover material, we'll do that as we go forward, okay? So any questions for me about where things stand and what we're doing and whatnot? Okay, well, feel free. I don't mean to tell everybody you can't speak out, because you can. I muted 1 or 2 people there just because we got some background noise and whatnot. So it might be a good idea to mute yourself unless you promise to keep it down, type of thing. So, anyway, well, let's go ahead and get started here on the material. If you do have questions, feel free to let me know. You can interrupt me. We're a small enough group that that's not an issue. Or you can type something in the chat box. It may take me a minute or so to get back here to the computer. to see that, but nonetheless, feel free to do that. So what we're going to do today, and by the way, these slides I'm going to post right after class, so they're available, and you just look for the link. It'll say Survey of Economics, Week 9. I also earlier today posted a couple of video links to some of this, to what we're talking about today. One is about a 13-minute video, and it features Milton Friedman, who is associated with the classical school, and it's a pretty good video. It's in fact, it's a little dated, or it seems a little dated because it's from like the late 70s. So well, it seems like it's dated, but it's not so much dated because some of the things he's talking about then are now recurring issues like inflation. So we're going to certainly be talking more about inflation when we come back from our from the exam and get into the next bit of content. The other video is a sort of a rap number. It's two guys, one who is John Maynard Keynes, the other is Friedrich Hayek, and they're kind of rapping about economic theory. It's okay. I don't want to tell you it's the funniest thing you've ever seen before, because it's not, but it is kind of interesting, and a little bit of a different twist on that. So you can take both of those are available. The links are there. That's about a 7-minute, actually it's about a 6-minute video. There's about a minute of credits, and so once you start to get to the credits, you're done with that one. So so I want to talk about schools of thought. So just to back up a little bit to go forward, we have said in macroeconomic thinking, because this is the part of the class in which we're talking about economic theory. Up to the very beginning, remember we talked at the very beginning about some of the basics of economics, supply and demand, who the actors are, firms, households, governments, and the circular flow model of goods and labor and money coming the other direction. We talked a bit about supply and demand and equilibrium within markets. We talked a bit about government policy, which we're going to revisit next week. We'll probably carry on some of this, carry over some of that for next week. We'll talk a bit about government policy. But then I wanted to sort of bring you up to speed on where we are in terms of economic thinking, because it does change over time. And in fact, not only does it change over time, but there are still meaningful and significant disputes among people in the economics profession at this very moment about some pretty basic stuff, like where's the role of government? And in fact, if you take these two schools, Keynesian, or sometimes they like to go by the term mainstream school, they're sort of reclaiming their sort of lost prestige that they sort of had banged up throughout the 70s through the 90s. So they don't like to call themselves mainstreams. As opposed to the classical / neoclassical school, if there's any one big differentiating factor that divides them, it's the role of government. And we're going to talk again and again about the role of government, because it really is central to what's going on. And that is the idea of where does government fit in? What should government be doing? Okay, so we talked about the Keynesians, beginning with the work of John Maynard Keynes himself, beginning in 1936, and his work was really mainstream economics up until about the late 1970s. And the problem was that he was by that time considered to be a bit outdated, meaning that his work was sort of, even though his main work was titled The General Theory, it almost seemed like to many people in the econ profession that it was more of a special theory. It was not the general case of how economics behave, how economies behave, but rather a special case where an economy is flat on its back due to depression and recession, bank failure, massive foreclosures, massive unemployment. And as a result, the only thing that can rebuild the economy is government action. And as a result of that, a lot of economists were saying, wait a minute, okay, but now we're not looking at this. It's 1970s, it's 1980s. In fact, we're not seeing an economy flat on its back. We're seeing an economy racing at light speed and going too fast, needing to slow down and get government out of the way. And so the classicists pushed back against Keynesianism, saying, really the issue is government itself, not the lack of government. Now that seems like a pretty big distinction. One group arguing government is needed to manage the economy, to fine tune things, to keep it, sort of make course corrections. The other group is saying government's not the solution, government is the problem. And that is a big, big distinction factor. So let's talk about the classicists. I want to sort of revisit a little bit some of the early classicists we talked about, even though we didn't really define them as such. And that includes, and I said it's based upon some of the original economic thinking hopefully you guys can see that. I know we've got a bit of I can only do, I can sort of focus on as well as I can here, but it's based on original economic thinking, going really back to the very beginning of when people even began thinking about economics. And we're talking about the works of Adam Smith, of course, whom we've talked about, David Ricardo we've talked about. We didn't talk about Bentham very much. We talked a bit about Marx, we talked a bit about Malthus. And admittedly, these groups, this is a pretty diverse group of thinkers. And particularly, it doesn't get much more starkly different between Ricardo and Marx. I can't think of two economists of that era, the 19th century, who disagreed more vehemently of actors in the economy, private actors. Whereas Ricardo was saying, let private actors do their thing, government, you're the problem, stay out. Whereas Marx is saying, no, government is needed. In fact, the labor movement should take over the government and basically overthrow the capitalists who are exploiting everyone else, that sort of thing. So we've talked ad nauseum now, I think, about Marx, but nonetheless, these are the original economic thinkers. Now, by the way, the term classical economics was not, and the reason that when we first started talking about Smith and Ricardo, et cetera, and we didn't identify them as the classical school, was because they really didn't think of themselves as belonging to a particular category, really. Because really, first of all, there's no category to compare them to. So, you know, sometimes it's useful to categorize something because in order to distinguish from something that it's not. So as a result, there's really nothing to distinguish them from one another. Jeremy Bentham is a writer we haven't talked about. He got into a lot of discussion, was really sort of a critic of early capitalism and coined the term conspicuous consumption. That is the idea that people, as they acquire wealth, want everybody to know they're acquiring wealth. And so they buy expensive houses and expensive jewelry and all these kinds of things to prove to the world they are successful. And so all these groups, all these writers, they don't have much in common other than the fact that they were mostly linked in time. One name I did not mention was John Stuart Mill, and I talked about him just briefly. He also fits into this, particularly in his work folds very nicely into a group that we're going to call student school. We'll get to them a bit later, okay? So this group didn't have anything to distinguish itself against. And so the term classicists was sort of coined by Keynes himself. And I think I mentioned this to you before, that it's a sort of a sign of his own personal audacity to say that everybody before me was a little bit wrong, and we're going to sort of categorize them all together and say that they are classical economic thinkers. Now, the classicists, in particular, the neoclassicists, which neo is just simply new classical, which are the more modern version of these guys have long been gone. But these have not been gone from the scene so long. They sort of took up the mantle and said, okay, we'll call ourselves classicists. And we'll revisit some of the original ideas, particularly with regard to the role of government. Okay, and so it's the neoclassicists primarily that we're going to be talking about. And so if I use the term classical, neoclassical, it's really the same sorts of ideas, because on the next slide, I'm going to talk about what some of these mainstay principles are within classical economic thinking. Even though there are variations and disagreements among members of that very large, and by the way, a very diverse group of people, there are disagreements within them. There are some commonalities of belief, particularly that issue of the role of government. So in the 20th century, the thinkers included people like von Mises and Hayek, who together were sort of the leading lights of what came to be called the Austrian school, a very interesting group of thinkers that we'll talk about. Controversial, no question, but one of the things that I have talked about is the fact that economics is controversial. There are things that come up all the time that I mean, you may not want to hear about Karl Marx, right? He may bother you, and that's fine. Nobody's saying you have to accept it. Nobody's saying you have to accept any of this. We're just simply saying, let's introduce you to these thinkers and let you decide. And by the way, I mean, as Keynes himself said, that the world is ruled by little else but defunct economists, and so and economic thinkers, and so you kind of get the idea that these ideas come and go, and it's up to us to decide what pieces of this we like and what we don't like. Okay, so the other name is Milton Friedman. We're going to talk about Friedman. Of all the members of the group, in fact, if I had to take all the macroeconomics, which is that sort of one big branch of macroeconomics, which is big picture economics, global economy, big national economies. The two people that would go at the top of the list, the very top of the list would be Milton Friedman, who was an American economist who died about 15 years ago, something like that. Was very elderly at the time, had actually been around and worked in the Roosevelt administration during the Great Depression. Was actually responsible for coming up with the payroll withholding. So if you wonder why you don't get all of your paycheck, you can thank Milton Friedman for that. He came up with that idea as a way to primarily fund World War II, was to have people pay their taxes every time they got paid, not just when they filed once a year. So Friedman's one on the list, the other is Keynes. So Keynes and Friedman sort of stand at the top, mostly because they really revolutionized economic thinking in very many ways. And they did have lots to disagree with. They weren't really contemporaries in a lot of ways. Keynes died in 1946. Friedman died about 60 years later. They weren't really contemporaries. They, Keynes was in Britain, Friedman was in the US and the Midwest. So, they didn't really cross paths that much. Kind of like Smith and Ricardo didn't really cross paths all that much. Ricardo and Malthus did, however, so for sure. Okay, so yes, there was an interesting time. The late 20th century was a very interesting and very fertile time for economic thinking, and that was the new Keynesian ideas that were coming about. We talked a bit about some of the Keynesian followers like Tobin at Yale and Samuelson at MIT and others. And we're going to talk about some of the followers of some of the early classicists, and today we sometimes call them freshwater economists because of their concentration around the Great Lakes, which are freshwater lakes, as opposed to the oceans on both coasts, which are saltwater economists, where the Keynesians tend to reside, but not universally. The big epicenter of this is the University of Chicago. This is where Friedman worked for many years. Also, Hayek was there for many years. Many classical economic theory came from the University of Chicago or made their way there at some point. And so a lot came out of that. This is my alma mater, Indiana, which was also sort of known for neoclassical thinking. And I know I got a lot of doses of anti-Keynesianism as a student there from professors who didn't really want to hold back very much on the way they believed about certain economic things. By the way, for anybody who's a major in economics, and maybe you know about it, it's not a particularly abundant major. A lot of people take econ because it's a prereq for business and pre-business sorts of admission, or people take it as elective, whatever. But to major in it, a lot of this comes up again in a 400 level course, in which that is a pretty deep dive into some of the actual literature, some of the actual reading. Some of these thinkers you may be told, okay, read The Road to Serfdom by Hayek, or read something that's major, and maybe read Ricardo's Principles, something like that. So these names come, and then some deeper dive into the actual theories. This is not intended to be a very technical class. We are just sort of covering some of the brush strokes around which some of these unfold. So what are some of the tenets? What are some of the things that we should know? Tenets or principles or general common beliefs. Number one is that economies are typically stable and they operate at or near full employment. And this is an important thing, and it weaves its way through pretty much everything that I can think of in terms of what we would associate with neoclassical thinking. It's the idea that economies are generally okay, and that they really don't need that much government intervention because they're mostly stable. They could, and so as a result, and they're usually at full employment. And if they're not at full employment, they will get themselves back to full employment for a lot of different mechanisms. And the sort of this idea that the market mechanism, the market system is a very efficient functioning system is also a pretty key tenet here. And it works both at the microeconomic level and the macro level. So it's, in a lot of ways, it's sort of an expansion of microeconomics, dealing with, remember, micro deals with individual markets, to the macro, which is the entire economy. And the idea is, let's take a market like the market for shoes, for instance. Let's say that you've got a market, let's say it's a closed off market. Albuquerque has no goods coming in, no goods leaving. And so we have shoemakers in Albuquerque. Let's say they overproduce shoes. We've just got too many shoes. Shoes are piling up on shelves. People don't want to buy them. So in other words, there's a surplus of shoes. And so what happens? Well, to get rid of those shoes, then sellers will mark the prices down. People who are reluctant to buy a pair of shoes at, say, $50 may be very tempted to buy it at $30. So as a result, those inventory moves, that clears off because the price mechanism forces that surplus out of the picture. Likewise, if there's a shortage of shoes, there aren't enough shoes being produced. And so as a result, people are really eager for shoes, they're willing to pay up for it. So shoes that would go for $50 now are going to go for $75. And by the way, if you don't like it, you can get out of line. Somebody will pay $75 for this pair of shoes because guess what? There's a shortage. The price mechanism will ration those, and the shortage will eventually go away because why? Sellers will say, $75 that we're going to get for making shoes, we'll simply produce more. And by producing more, that brings down the ultimate price because we no longer have a shortage of shoes. Okay, what does this mean for the macroeconomy? It's this very same idea. It's that notion of just some individual market blown up, particularly in the labor market. And this is an important issue. And if we think about a recession, okay, which is the next item here, when a recession exists, the economy will self-correct. And how does it do that? It's very analogous to what we talked about with the market for shoes. What is unemployment from a pure, very sterile, it's not very humanistic view. But from a purely mechanical view, it's a surplus of labor, as in there's too much labor in response to the demand for labor. That is, firms would maybe hire workers, they would do it at lower wages, they wouldn't pay at higher wages. And so as a result, what happens? There's excess supply of labor. I know it sounds very like we're sort of taking we're sort of being very mechanistic about what is a human problem. I understand that. But just from a pure mechanical standpoint, excess labor. So what happens? Well, the classicists believe that the recession, which is characterized by unemployment, right, will cure itself because workers will eventually do what? They'll take a wage cut. So what do we see happening when we see recessions? Economic downturns, businesses lay workers off. By the way, we are beginning to see the slowdown that we have long begun to foresee long back several months ago when the Federal Reserve, our central bank, started raising interest rates to slow the economy down, to try to hit the brakes in the economy to get this inflation under control. We're starting to see layoffs. There's a friend of mine who teaches in a doctoral program, and she was saying that she has her husband, I think, worked for a mortgage company. He's looking for a job. He's a pretty senior guy. He's looking for a job because the mortgage business has just gotten smacked and it's just on its back. People aren't buying homes because interest rates are high, and they're definitely not refinancing because what's the point of refinancing? It's usually to get a lower interest rate, and we've had interest rates on mortgages for so long that pretty much everybody who wanted to get a lower rate has already gotten that done, and so nobody really is refinancing mortgages, and so that's the beginning. And by the way, when we talk about this idea in macro, for those of you who will go on to take macro, and some of you might, we say that when the Federal Reserve is trying to slow things down by raising interest rates, interest-sensitive parts of the economy react first, and I can't think of any more interest rate sensitive area than real estate. Almost everything connected with real estate is very volatile, up and down, up and down. It's feast or famine, whether it's construction, realty, remodeling might be a little bit better because people may remodel as opposed to buy a new home, maybe add on a room if they're able to, that sort of thing. But realty, construction, the mortgage business, appraising, title companies, they all suffer. Surveyors, they all suffer as a result of a downturn. So we're starting to see that begin to happen, okay? Now, how does the economy self-correct and move toward full employment equilibrium? Workers who were making $20 per hour and are laid off now are facing what? Well, okay, yes, we have unemployment insurance, but it doesn't last forever, and it doesn't really replace your income. And I know this was an easier discussion to have pre-COVID because I know a lot of people got some pretty good sized unemployment checks, in addition to stimulus checks, in addition to rent abatement. So there were a lot of things that were one time only. And for those of you who may have gotten that and think, well, this is the way it is, that's usually not the way it is. I don't think we're going to, well, knock on wood, hopefully we don't have any more pandemics, but we probably won't see that happening. Instead, if you're laid off, what traditionally happens is, yes, you might apply for unemployment benefits, but it does not replace one's income, nor is it designed to, because the idea is to just stay alive until you get a new job, and you're expected to find a new job but it's not intended to replace your income. So you may take a job at $10 per hour or $12 per hour as opposed to $20 because you would rather work than not work, rather earn income than not earn income, particularly as those benefits run out and as your savings run out and as all the sources of funds you can get your hands on. You sold your motorcycle, you sold your stereo, whatever. Now you need to take a lower wage in order to get working, and you'll do that. And by the way, that's a lot of the argument, which is a neoclassical argument against President Biden's numerous stimulus plans, were based on that idea. And I have heard that from so many students in the last, when did the pandemic begin? Almost 3 years ago, that all these stimulus programs are providing a lack of motivation for people to get back into the labor force. And evidence that people cite, and it's pretty good evidence to me, is what we call the labor force participation rate. People really aren't returning to the labor force like we thought that they would, and maybe the stimulus had some impact. Nonetheless, those are one-time events, and in reality, the classicists are saying that the labor market will fix itself, but it'll take time. It'll be painful. It'll be an adjustment, but nobody said life was not painful and didn't require adjustments, and it does. And so eventually the $20 an hour job is gone. It's not coming back anytime soon. Take the $10 an hour per job. As the economy begins to recover, as everyone's back to working and spending and borrowing and doing all these things, the economy will recover and you can get back to your previous wage at some point. But the surplus labor condition will correct itself. On the other hand, what about the other condition in which it's not a recession, but it's one that we're just coming out of? That's the economy going too quickly, where the unemployment rate is falling, and wages are rising. And as I've been saying for a long time to all of my classes, that these wage increases cannot be sustained. I mean, they just cannot, And the last time that I saw entry-level wages be as high as they are relative to, and I hate to say relative to minimum wage, because the minimum wage is almost irrelevant in a lot of ways. And I don't mean to say it's not important, but most people don't actually work at minimum wage. Adults, that is. Teens, yeah, different story. But as you get further and further out of that, it doesn't really make any difference. But these wage increases just cannot sustain themselves, because what's going to happen is firms are just simply not going to hire people, and they're going to expect their workers to do more, or their service is going to suffer. I think we've definitely seen service suffer in the last couple of years as the unemployment rate has fallen, and we've had all kinds of issues regarding that. Nonetheless, either side of the business cycle, too low, too high, it will self-correct and it will move back toward full employment. Okay, so and some of this is repetitious. Demand and supply are relatively stable, but here's the kicker, and this is where the rubber hits the road in terms of differentiating classical thinking from Keynesianism, and that is that remember what Keynes was all about was creating new demand. That if those two actors, households and businesses, cannot create demand throughout the economy, because they can't or won't, can't be convinced to, can't be incentivized to do so, the government can do so. But the problem is the classists are saying all that does is if you increase government spending, it does not change what we call real. And real is basically what we call inflation adjusted GDP. Remember, GDP is that top line number. If you sucked up all the activity in the economy and put a dollar figure on it in a year, that would be the number, GDP. It's the total activity, all the production of goods and services for a year. But government spending does not raise that, particularly when we factor in inflation, because all it does is bring inflation. It does not bring out real economic growth. And by the way, I do expect that we're going to see a revival of some of these economic thinkers as we're in an inflationary environment right now. And the government is struggling to try to go the other direction to try to bring demand down. So not creating new demand, but taking demand down. So this is a very interesting time that we're all sort of witnessing from an economic standpoint, because the idea is that classical thinkers that always say, look, whenever there's inflation, it's because government created it. It's hard to argue with that point of view, however, because why? Because money is a government creation. Government has a monopoly on creating money. Government has a monopoly on creating money. We're going to come back to that idea next week or the week after, whenever we talk more about monetary policy specifically. I know we've already previously defined it a little bit in broad brushstrokes, but we're going to sort of dig into the details a little bit and talk a little bit about what's going on now, because I do think one of the fun things about this class is that you all probably know about as much as what's going on economically, just from hearing what we're talking about here, than what a lot of people working on Wall Street will know, just as much, because we're sort of on top of these things and watching what's happening and whatnot. Okay, so classical theorists will always say, hey, whenever there's inflation, because government creates a monopoly on money, then it's a government-caused problem. And if you look at some of the wild inflationary periods throughout history, whether it's crazy inflation like Germany in the 1920s, Argentina in the 1980s and 90s, it was because of the fact that government was just simply running the printing presses, just printing more and more money. And by the way, one of the videos, which I think you'll like that Friedman video, he talks about running the printing presses and how, as a result, it's really sort of cheating the public when there's inflation, because, okay, maybe you got a 5% increase in wages at work. Great. The problem is prices are going up by 8%. Not great, right? So yeah, you got a 5% increase in pay, but the prices of rent and food and insurance are all going up. So not so great. So but if people aren't picking up on that and are not savvy to that, then they may have this illusion that they're getting inflation. And by the way, the classicists have pushed back on Keynes's assertion that people won't notice a little bit of inflation. He was not so much worried about inflation. So people aren't going to notice it. Just go ahead. Even if it does cause inflation, we can create new demand, get the economy back to full employment. And if you get a little bit of inflation, okay, that's fine. Okay, it's a good sign. It's a sign that things are strong, right? Well, not so much in this case, because now the government is saying, or classes are saying, it's gone too far. And of the two tools, and remember, we just defined what they were not long ago, that we said fiscal and monetary policy. Fiscal policy, again, is government policy enacted by elected officials, Congress and the president. Monetary policy is that which is implemented by our unelected officials, the Federal Reserve. But the tool that is preferred is monetary policy and not fiscal policy. And by the way, in that video you'll see from Friedman, and there are many videos of Milton Friedman. He was very ubiquitous throughout the 1970s and 80s. He had a television show, which is the first I ever saw of an economist, with his own TV show on PBS, where, yes, he was a conservative kind of guy, but he talked about the idea that government, the problem with government, in his view, was the idea that government just doesn't know when to stop. That you create a government agency to deal with a particular problem, and it just never goes away because it's got institutional bureaucracy. It just never vanishes. And as a result, you've got this monstrosity in Washington, D.C., with offices all around the country, employing a lot of people, some of whom don't even know what they're doing, in his criticism, because, and my mother worked for the government at one time and often thought she didn't know what she was doing a lot of times. And that is a criticism of government. Sometimes you get overlapping responsibilities. Government bureaucracies just go on and on. And I can tell you that there is something that is popular, particularly in the private sector, to that particular criticism of government, the idea that you have government that just never sort of runs out of gas, just keeps growing arms and legs and all that. And just from my own industry that I grew up in, banking, we had overlapping regulators that did the same thing. Only they were slightly different. You had regulation by the Treasury Department, regulation by the FDIC, regulation by the Federal Reserve, regulation by the state. Those were all federal. Those were all regulation also by the state. They're all overlapping and all, it was difficult sometimes to know who are we supposed to be making happy here, particularly when they want different things from people. So as a result, this idea of government on steroids, government is a nightmare, government is a monstrosity, has made its way in a very large way in classical thinking. Okay, and I really like the video on Friedman and talking about this idea of what happens, particularly wages, in the event of a recession. And by the way, I know that it's very tempting, it really is, on the part of people, because particularly if you're a cable TV news consumer, as I am, where they kind of want to create, nice little categories of left and right, conservative and progressive and all that. And I think it's very tempting to say the classicists are conservatives and the Keynesians are liberals. And that's probably not wrong, but it's a little bit of an oversimplification. And the idea, first of all, even when we get into talking about the Austrian school, who are considered to be arch conservatives. Even Friedrich Hayek himself said, yeah, the government's got a role to play, particularly including in stabilization, but it should not be the God to which everyone prays. Of course, he kind of laid it on a little bit strong, as some of them do, but that is the way it goes. So let's talk about some of the branches, and I'll try to wrap up my discussion of this until around until about 3:45, so that we can talk a bit about the exam. So the first things that we'll talk about is monetarism. And we're going to revisit this a bit more in detail when we come back and talk more about monetary and fiscal policy. This is the theory surrounding monetary policy. And Milton Friedman is sort of the high priest of that, and what came to be called the Chicago School, that is out of the University of Chicago. Friedman and a lot of his like-minded economists and students, a lot of students who studied under Milton Friedman and sort of carried this banner. They were sometimes called the Chicago Boys, which I think is probably not a very useful term now because it sort of is gendered. But nonetheless, he had a group of consultants who I think probably were mostly male, who went around the world advising governments. And around the world, they were known as the Chicago Boys. But I think today we mostly refer to them as the Chicago School, which very definitely argued for the supremacy of monetary policy, controlling the money supply as opposed to controlling taxation, government spending, government bureaucracy. And it argued for a controlled monetary policy. Again, I don't want to get too deeply into this because I will come back and cover this in more detail. What can be called the monetary price rule. And I will probably also talk about, in a sort of general sense, the idea of economic policy as being either one of two philosophical approaches, that is a rules-driven approach or a discretionary approach. A rules-driven approach tends to be more associated with classicists who say, look, let's just set a rule for how we regulate the economy and let's stick to it. And once we stick to the rules, everybody knows the rules and everybody understands what's going on. And we'll talk about what exactly the monetary rule, the monetary price rule is about. But that's one. Discretionary policy says, let's just handle it as things come up. We can't create a rule for things that we don't know are going to happen. If we knew there was going to be a pandemic, who knew? Who saw it coming, right? Or who knows if there's a World War II that comes along, something like that, something that you just can't predict. And so discretionary approaches to policy are the idea that you have to just take things as they are. It's much more pragmatic, it's much more ad hoc, it's much more situational. This is much more general and more fixed in place. And so, but we'll come back to that, and it's associated with Friedman's work. It is, and I know we keep coming back to these themes, it is skeptical of the role of government, and that government intervention is considered tantamount to interference. Now that can't be too much, that can't be much different or any further different than what Keynes said, where Keynes said government is a facilitating factor. It can get an economy to full employment, it can stabilize the economy, it can deal with the excesses through sort of tweaking the economy, turning a few knobs, flipping a few switches, and all these things can help bring an economy to full employment. Well, the classicists are very skeptical of that. And by the way, when we talk about the work of Friedrich Hayek, Hayek had said, look, of all the billions of transactions in the economy, what makes government think that it can control all of this and keep this under control? And by the way, it was a very much a skeptical view of the existing communist systems in the world that were then operating in the world then, that didn't do a very good job of trying to plan production and consumption decisions from a central location. Just didn't really work very well. In fact, it worked miserably poorly, which is why the Soviet Union fell, which is why China, which is still sort of, I guess, theoretically communist, is now not so much. Of course, China is a very interesting example of an economy that did not change its sort of political theory, but definitely changed its economic theory. Russia tried to really change both, and there have been a lot of problems with that. But we could go on and on about Russia and China, but we won't do that here. What's another school? These are just simply branches of what. Remember, this is a very diverse group. These classes. It's something called supply side economics. Okay. You don't hear this term very much anymore. It was in vogue throughout the 1980s, and it was almost a sort of neoclassical revival. It was sort of the leading wave of pushing back against Keynes and his followers. Because by the early 1980s, the idea was that, hey, all we're getting for our government dollars is inflation. We're not getting the full employment that was promised. We're getting lots of government intervention in the economy. And as a result, why doesn't the government just simply try to prop up the supply side? Now, by the way, in last week's discussion, which I've read many of those posts in Brightspace, and a lot of them are very good. And a few of you were saying that maybe the government should, and remember the question was, should the government focus on tweaking demand, which is sort of a Keynesian idea, or should it try to manage supply? And a number of you said manage supply, because demand, someone said demand is very fickle, it can change. Demand for goods is up and down, it's here, it's there. Who can predict demand? Well, that's a good question, actually. But supply is much more rationally derived. I don't produce a good as a supplier unless I know I can sell it, or at least I feel pretty strongly I can sell it at this price, at this cost of production. And as a result, the idea is let's prop up the supply side of the economy, which, by the way, sounds like it's a pro-business approach and pro-business only. But that's not really necessarily the case, because remember, labor supply, what all of us do, for those of us who work, we're part of the supply side of the economy as well. And what some of the supply siders were saying is, look, it has to do with freedom of choice and what you want to do. And so as a result, rather than have the government decide that you're going to be an astronaut or a ballerina or whatever, like some of the command states did, let you decide what to do. And if you want to become an astronaut, you can try to become an astronaut. If you want to make shampoo versus conditioner, you make shampoo and not conditioner. These are supply side decisions that, once again, sort of follow this theme of government skepticism. Okay, and the big thing here is tax policy. And for those of you who take macro, you probably will be, you may hear about the work of one of the University of Chicago guys named Arthur Laffer. Laffer is one of the few names of people who's still alive, and although I don't think he is anymore on econ faculty, I think the last I heard about him, he was living in Nashville, Tennessee, and was running an investment firm. So why Nashville? I don't know. Maybe he likes country music. I don't know. But Laffer was a pretty big name throughout the 1980s, kind of like Friedman in the sense that he had his own little segment on PBS pretty much every night, where he would wax and wane and would basically criticize tax policy. Tax policy was really central to that. The idea of if you are skeptical of government, then you've got to be skeptical of taxation, because that's how government derives its oxygen, right? Is through taxation. Cut off the air supply, you cut off government involvement, and it's not the fact that people want to kill government. And I know that sometimes people misconstrue some of the economic thinking of the classicists by saying that, like I saw as I was sort of prepping for this, I saw something called anarcho-capitalism, which is not what we want to talk about here, but is an extreme version of classical thinking that says that we should try to take government down to its bare minimum. And if we err on the side of one way or another, it's having too little government as opposed to having too much government. And I know Friedman himself was sort of at times criticized, maybe a bit unfairly, for being an anarchist. And it didn't help matters that his son actually was an anarchist, his son David. Anarchy is simply the condition where government is removed. There's no government. We are basically on our own. That's a tough sell. I don't think most people would buy into that at all. And so the point I want to make here is the idea that anarcho-capitalism is really an extreme version that is not really to be construed with classical economic thinking in general. Okay, so supply side economics. Now, one of the problems with supply side thinking, we don't hear it too much anymore, except maybe in politics, particularly maybe more conservative politicians talk about it. It sort of fell through the cracks a little bit, in particular because of something called the Laffer curve, which I won't get into. If you really are dying to know what it's about, it's in the book, it's in the textbook. You can certainly look at it, or you can get with me. I will spend however much time you want to hear on it, but it was largely discredited in many ways, because it basically said government cuts taxes, you'll actually end up raising more government tax revenue anyway, because the fact free up all these it'll free up businesses and individuals to pursue what they want to do. If government lowers your individual taxes, your personal taxes, you've got more money now to buy a new car or spend money on education or start a business or whatever. And if you're a business, then your government cuts your taxes, you can expand product lines, hire new workers, build up on inventory, buy new equipment, all those kinds of things. And so as a result, all this activity is creating sales tax revenue, income tax revenue, all this kind of stuff. It didn't really create the revenue that was promised, however. So, and I know that we talk about it in macro and students say, wait a minute, you just spent 20 minutes talking about Laffer curve that isn't actually correct. And why did you do that? And I usually say the reason I do that is because I'm not necessarily telling you what is correct and what's not correct. Unless it's very obvious, this is patently obvious, the Laffer curve did not live up to expectations. But why do I talk about it is the question. It's because many people in politics, in our politics, still believe very vehemently in the power of government to raise more tax revenue by cutting taxes. It seems sort of counterintuitive, and I suppose it probably is. It's kind of like you do, like what they said during Vietnam, you have to destroy a village to save it, right? That sort of thing, and that's kind of the economic version of that, without getting, without pushing the example too far there. So we talk about it because many people in government believe it. It's been the basis for lots of our tax cut decisions over many years. And let's see, so I'm running out of time here, and I think, let me see, I want to do this, and I want to do the Austrian school. Let me real briefly cover rational. Let me skip rational expectations. And I just won't put it on the exam if I had a temptation to do that. You can read that for yourself. We cover it much more in the macro course 2110. For those of you who will take it, and anybody who's going to business school will probably come across this at some point. I don't have time really, because I'd really rather get to review it for the exam, but I did want to talk about a sort of a unique version of classical thinking called the Austrian school. And it's not like they got together and said, hey, we're the Austrian school, where we have a building, we have a club, we have membership. No, it's not quite like that. It's more of an informal association. So named, though, because a lot of the early thinkers, again, named Karl Menger, in addition to the two that I've mentioned here, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, just happen to be Austrian. And as a result, that's sort of where that term got its name. But you don't have to be Austrian to adhere to some of this thinking. And in fact, Hayek himself was a British subject from about World War II, actually before World War II, because he'd been in the Austrian army in World War I and didn't like that experience very much, and so moved it to Britain, where he was too old to have been in World War II. But my point was that it's just simply you can both. It's not the affiliation with Austria is only sort of a legacy one as far as that goes. Mises is interesting, sort of predated by a few years Hayek, but Hayek certainly I think was the bigger name. Mises's principal work was something called human action, and for anybody who is really interested in this idea, oh, by the way, what is the main idea? Let me back up here before I get into this. What is it all about? It's based on the idea that social and economic events are really are not driven by large class movements and populations wanting to do things. Populations don't want to go to war. They are coerced into going to war, the argument is, by governments that make them do that. And so as a result, government is a culprit. And so we have too much government. Remember, that's a theme that runs, it's a thread that runs through all of neoclassical thinking, doesn't it? Instead, it's about individual actions and motivations. It's the role of individuals and their business firms to do what they want to do. Now, I know that the Austrians have been criticized extensively, particularly by Keynesians and neo-Keynesians and progressives in the political sphere of things. I will give them a bit of a pass in some of this, because if you think about Hayek in particular, who grew up in Austria, Austria was about 200 miles away from Soviet tanks being positioned. They could roll over the border at any time. Austria was always on the front lines of this idea of a totalitarian state that could easily crush them and take them over if they wanted to do so. And Austria came very close to becoming part of the Soviet sphere of influence right after World War II. Had it not been for the American and British presence, it might very well have been. because it's next door neighbor. Hungary certainly was. Hungary certainly was. And by the way, Hayek talked about the fact that these tanks that could roll across the border, and remember, government tanks, it's a government operation, right? Moving and crushing, individual liberty movements. The Soviet government had done that twice in 1956 in next door in Hungary, and then in 1968 in Czechoslovakia. And then they were poised to do it again in Poland, which they did not do. And probably by that time, the Soviet state was sort of weebling and wobbling and probably didn't, and were already jammed up in Afghanistan. So they had their own difficulties. What was my point? My point is, though, it's pushing back against collectivist command states that try to make all the decisions for people. But instead, the reality is that the reality is that individual actions are what drive economic decision making. We do things for our own purposes and for those of the benefit of our family. And we're not motivated, as Mises said, by this idea of collective action. That workers don't get together and decide to overthrow their business owners, because the business owners are their partners, really, in some ways. They write their paychecks, right? They may not like their bosses. No one's saying you've got to like, your employer, but your employer does pay you. So there is a partnership. And so the idea that there has to be conflict, which is very definitely a cornerstone of Marxism, doesn't have to be the case. And by the way, what do workers have in common with each other? I mean, we're not talking about workers working in the same, Coca-Cola bottling plant. What they have together is they work in the same place. But what do those workers have to do with workers who work at a shoe store, or workers who work at PetSmart, or workers who work at Sandia National Labs? There's not much that ties them together. And nor do they really agree that they have their own individual views. They do things for their own individual reasons. And so Hayek returns to this idea in his major work, which is called The Road to Serfdom, where he said, look, we do things for our own particular reasons. And if government gets involved, it does it because it wants us to do certain things that we don't want to do, and pushes us in directions we don't want to do. And as a result, we are on this sort of road to serfdom, and he was specifically pointing at the Soviet Union, wasn't he, in that time when he wrote that book. And by the way, this is a massive bestseller. You can still find this on Amazon today. I think you have no trouble finding it. Probably used copies galore. Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister of Britain for many years, was asked at a Conservative Party conference, what do we believe in? And she immediately pulled out a copy of The Road to Serfdom and said, this is what we believe in. And it was the idea of reducing the role of government in the economy and promoting those of individual actors to pursue their own individual interests. Okay? All right. So questions for me about anything? I'm going to bring the lights back up here. And I want to talk about the exam. I just want to review a bit for it. And there's a reason I postponed the exam from last time. And it's simply because of the fact that I like to review a bit before I give the exam. So here's the, let me turn that off a little bit there. Okay. Okay, let me see. Okay, can everybody hear me? Because I don't see the, okay. Hopefully, okay, the other transcription is back. I apologize for that. I just wanted to turn off the projector just because it, well, I didn't really need it, but I should have done that. So anyway, I apologize. So anyway, here's the exam. This is what to expect. It's going to be in Brightspace. If you look under the week 9 learning module, just click on week 9 under coursework content, and it'll be exam 1. There'll be 40 questions, 10 true false. And I think I gave you this last time, but I just want to just make sure you have it. 10 true false, 20 multiple choice, and 10 fill in the blank questions. And because there's a fill in the blank question, I've got to manually review those. Unlike quizzes that are auto-graded by the system, I'll have to grade those themselves. And so give me a few days to do that. So there is a makeup. Aren't able to take it this week. You can still take it next week, but you'll lose 10% or 10 points, because altogether the 40 questions, 2.5 points each, work out to 100 points possible on the exam itself. You'll have one chance to take it. So what I would say, because you have 90 minutes, what I would say is, and I always tell students this, just for your own particular benefit, I would you just do it in one sitting, someplace where you're comfortable and you feel like you're not going to be interrupted and whatnot, but also that you've got resources available so that if you are stumped on a question, that within that 90 minutes you can say, okay, I don't remember this, but let me see if I can find it. I know that open book exams are controversial among a lot of people in my business because the feeling is that maybe people use it as a crutch and don't prepare quite as thoroughly as they should, instead of thinking, oh, okay, I've got time during the exam, where you maybe don't have quite the time you've got. So I will leave that up to you to decide how much time you think you've got. That's part of the challenge of college, is to try to figure out how much time you've got in order to get everything done. And that's part of it's part of what we put you through. So, but anyway, I think 40 questions is not onerous, and you'll have more than a couple minutes per question. Some of these undoubtedly will be fairly straightforward. So let's talk about what to expect. Now, so nothing on rational expectations. Also, there is nothing on the what's it called? Oh, the Phillips curve. I mentioned the Phillips curve in the week 9 module, and I just, as I was preparing for class today, I thought, I'm not going to cover the Phillips curve. It's not really, I mean, it's important. Those of you who take macro again, you'll get it again. It doesn't really fit that tightly into the whole theoretical piece. So, but rational expectations we also will not talk about. Okay. So here's what you want to know for the exam. You want to know about these 2 schools of economic thinking. These are very broad schools that are very diverse within each of them. The classical / neoclassical and Keynesian or / mainstream, and know what their respective theories are with respect to government. That the classicists are generally skeptical about the role of government. They think that government has the tendency to do too much, can go too far, and so as a result, always errs on the side of doing too much, and as a result, can create inflationary conditions. The Keynesians believe that government is the solution to a lot of problems, particularly to unemployment and recession. And as a result, government should be looked to as an agent for change, particularly when the other 2 actors can't get the job done. That is, the other 2 actors being business households. And speaking of those, know about the circular flow model we talked about. That is also discussed in your book, and you can look at that for yourself. We have the 3 actor groups that are households and businesses, which constitute together what we call the private sector, where we say that decisions tend to be made privately and in the actor's own self-interest. And the public sector, which is government and all its agencies, where government acts typically in for the benefit of all of society. Okay. And then the circular flow model. Remember what's going on in the circular flow model. We're tying together all 3 actors. We've got one big sort of flow of transactions of goods and labor that we call the physical flow, or the quote unquote real economy. And then the other direction to compensate for that is the market for spending and wages. So goods are compensated for by spending, and labor is compensated for by wages. And so one is a physical flow of stuff, goods and services, and then a financial flow that goes in the other direction in order to compensate for that. Again, that circular flow model is discussed at quite a bit of length in the textbook. And if you want to get additional resources, I think I mentioned when I first began talking about this in class that I said, I think if you were to Google circular flow model, you'd have millions of hits. So no shortage whatsoever of material as to what that's about. Okay. We also talked early on in the course about scarcity and what it was about. And we said that it forms the basis of what's called the economizing problem in economics. The economizing problem is this central conflict, this central problem in economics. The problem is that we've got unlimited wants, theoretically at least, and yet we've got scarce resources to satisfy those wants, which means that we have to solve the problem by markets that ration goods and services and available resources so that we can get some of what we want or most of what we want. We may not be able to get all we want, but nonetheless, scarcity is an issue. If scarcity did not exist, then I really doubt we would be talking very much about economics, because what would be the point of talking about economics if there was nothing scarce? We don't talk about the scarcity of breathing air, right? I mean, it's freely available. Nobody has it, or sunlight or wind, right? These are freely available. There's no real scarcity of them. And so as a result, we don't really have a price tag on breathable air or sunlight, okay? And no markets to divvy them out. And I know somebody's going to say solar power. That's true. That's a different utilization of that. We also talked about one of the other model besides the circular flow model was that of the production possibilities model, also called the production possibilities frontier, where is a generalized model that's used pretty much everywhere in econ to describe the issue of choice. And if I do more of one thing, I give up some of another thing. And that the value of the thing that I give up is what's called an opportunity cost. An opportunity cost, it goes along with scarcity. It's the idea that if I do more of one thing, I have to inherently do less of something else. So here it's 4 o'clock. I could be doing something else besides working and earning a wage. And what else could I be doing? Well, I mean, you could, whatever. I could be, I could be in the gym, working a different job. I could be doing all kinds of things. But I gave that up in order to be here to do that. If I gave this up, then that would be the opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost is the value of what's given up. And the production possibilities model sort of lays out for us this idea of trade-offs. The idea of trade-offs. If I do more of one thing, I give up something of another. Okay, so that's the production possibilities model. We also talked about some of these economic thinkers, including Marx. And when we talked about Marx, we talked about his labor theory of value. We had a discussion in the weekly module in Brightspace about that, about the labor theory of value. And just remember, the labor theory of value basically says that labor is not usually compensated correctly for the value of the labor, because the value of labor exceeds what the wage is. But the wage is always going to be somewhat less than the value of output. The residual then flowing off to the owners of the factors of production, that is the business equipment and the business itself. And so that's a major tenet of Marxian theory, is this idea that labor is unfairly compensated. And all of the excess value will be what he calls surplus value, goes off to the owners of the enterprises themselves. Okay. Also know about Malthus, Thomas Malthus. Malthus was, when we think about Malthus, almost always it's one thing that comes to mind is population studies, what to do about population. His big thesis in the 19th century was that if you looked at the growth of the population versus the growth in the food supply, the population growth would outstrip the growth of the food supply, and as a result, there'd be mass starvation. And it seems like it doesn't transfer that well to the modern era. However, we're seeing large increases in population worldwide, and we are seeing instances in which people are dying of starvation and dehydration. And so it may not be that situation at all that he was talking about. Okay. Another early thinker was David Ricardo. And what was Ricardo's main issue? He was, once again, sort of picked up the thread that began with Adam Smith, where he talked about this idea of letting private actors do their own thing. In particular, free trade was his big issue because he was a member of the British Parliament at the time, and the British Parliament had these things called the Corn Laws, which we talked a bit about, which were really not so much about corn as they were more about wheat than corn. But they were to keep out imported grains. If you keep out the supply of anything, you drive the existing price up. And all that did was benefit those hereditary landowners who didn't really do much but extract value from the tenant farmers. In other words, the landlords were doing nothing really but sort of taking a piece of the action, if you like. He thought that was not fair. Why not open up to free trade and let the landowners go about competing like everybody else in the world? And so as a result, free trade was this big issue there, okay? Also know about, we talked about the two kinds of government economic policy, fiscal policy and monetary policy. And I just covered those in very broad brushes, very broad brushstrokes. Fiscal policy, again, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, is the idea of government taxation and government spending by elected officials. And monetary policy deals with government involvement in the economy, controlling the money supply and the availability of credit. And then within fiscal policy, we talked about a couple of principles of taxation. One is called the benefit principle, and the other is called the ability to pay principle. The benefit principle basically says, look, if you're getting some sort of benefit from the government itself, which is ours, that you ought to be able to pay more for that than somebody who doesn't want to get the benefits. And so as a result, the benefits principle sounds maybe on its face like it's some logic. Certainly there are a lot of people who believe that they shouldn't pay as much in taxes because they disagree with something. There have been all kinds of tax protests over the years, people protesting things like the war in Iraq. I'm not going to pay this much taxes, and I'm just going to unilaterally calculate my taxes based upon me taking out the portion that goes to me. It doesn't work that way. Instead, how it works is it's not who gets the benefit of something, it's who has the ability to pay. Who has the ability to pay. And by the way, the benefits principle, even though it may sound like it's maybe a little bit logical and fair, is also difficult because what is the value of the Environmental Protection Agency to you and your household? Give me a dollar figure, and you can't do it, nor can I do it. If there's anybody on the Zoom call that can do it, I feel like I could, maybe if I had to do it, I could, but I don't think so. I really don't think so. So as a result, I'm not assessed based upon my value of the EPA or the Department of Education or the Forest Service. It doesn't work that way. It's the ability to pay principle, okay? Also know, one other early economic thinker was Adam Smith. We talked a bit about him. And he was really the developer of something which I think most of all of us are familiar with. That's the division of labor. That is the idea of specialization, particularly on the labor side of things. That we all specialize in doing things. And I think I posted a video about Smith, which said, I think very correctly, that as the economy has developed and become bigger and wealthier and more sophisticated, that so does the classification of labor, to the point where you do very specialized things, and if you're in a different occupation, you really can't talk about what's going on. You don't speak the same language a lot of times. If you talk to people in software development, they'll talk about Perl and SQL and all these kinds of things that are terms that we don't use as economists, right? But they deal with every day. But things like demand and supply, that may not appeal to them so much. So that's the idea of division of labor. We focus on doing smaller and smaller and smaller things, but we do it very, very well. And you can see division of labor in all throughout the economy, even in sports, right? Pitchers don't usually hit the ball very well in baseball, and kickers, guys who kick field goals, don't tackle people usually. Every now and then, but not very well. So they specialize in doing different things, okay? Let's see. We talked a bit about this idea in classical thinking about government interference, and the idea that government interference was inflationary. And the names you want to from the classical discussion of earlier are Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek in particular. I don't believe there's a question about von Mises. But Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, you want to know about them and what their ideas were. Friedman was mostly into monetary economics. We're going to revisit some of his work next week because we're going to talk more about monetary theory, which we only just sort of introduced a bit today, but we're going to come back to it. Hayek talked a lot about this idea of government involvement itself in the economy constrains human freedom and our ability to act and to do the kind of things that we would naturally want to do. Sometimes we can't do what we want to do because we're hemmed in by government constraints, okay? Also know about some of the main works of some of the theories we talked about. The general theory was the main work of John Maynard Keynes. It's actually called the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. Ricardo has something called Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. That was what he was known for. Smith came up with The Wealth of Nations. That was what his major work was. Hayek, The Road to Serfdom. These are all ones that should be in the PowerPoint slides. And again, before I leave today, I'll post these slides that you just saw here in the Week 9 module. Okay. Okay. Any questions so far? I don't have the chat box open, but if you have questions, feel free to let me know. Let me see here. Oh, know about the law. We only have really 2 laws in economics, unlike chemistry and physics, where there are all kinds of laws that are going to work all over the place. We only have law of demand and law of supply. They simply relate price and quantity to each other. The law of demand says that the price of a good goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. The price of a good goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. So you have an inverse relationship. It's just the opposite with supply. Price goes up, quantity supply goes up. Price goes down, quantity supply goes down. So know about those 2 laws. Those are really only the 2 main laws. Yes, there are in macroeconomics, we have a few things that we call laws, but they're not really laws like what you might see in chemistry, for instance. It doesn't work quite that way. Okay. And then know about the type of systems, economic systems we talked about early on. Pure capitalism on one hand, also called laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire is basically a French term that means sort of more or less to let be, to allow to do, that sort of thing, without government involvement too significantly. Command economies are very, very heavy government involvement, where government basically says, these are the rules, this is what we're going to do. We're going to produce 50,000 refrigerators this year, we're going to produce 10,000 aircraft, whatever. And you're going to be an accountant, you're going to be an engineer. Those are command decisions. We don't have that many command economies remaining in the world today. And even the old Soviet Union was not that extreme, but they were certainly more extreme than what they are, what the Russian successor to that state is now. Also, socialism is sort of a middle ground. And I know that particularly in our country, a lot of people are sort of conditioned to believe that socialism is tantamount to command. A lot of politicians sort of push us in that direction, when in fact, it's really a middle ground in reality. In fact, every economy's got some elements of socialism. And that is government basically taking the basic functions of something. We have, in some cases, socialist, I know that a lot of people who pushed back against healthcare reform have said, we don't want socialized medicine. Well, we've already got some version of socialized medicine, because if you're over 65, you have Medicare, and that's a socialized healthcare system. If you're a veteran and you qualify for veterans benefits, that's a socialized government system. So there is socialism that exists, but as I mentioned when we talked about that, it's sort of a 31 flavors basket of Robbins. They all look a little bit different than each other. Some countries focus a lot more on things like free education. Denmark will allow you to go all the way to college and graduate school, law school, whatever, for free or no cost to yourselves. Some don't quite go that far with things like higher ed, okay? And finally, we talked about types of goods, and we talked about a couple of pairs of goods, substitutes and complements. A substitute is a good that can be swapped for another good in a purchase decision. A complement is a good that goes along with each other. So things like baseballs and baseball mitts go together as complementary goods, but softballs or baseballs and footballs are substitutes. It's one or the other, they don't go together. And then we have talked about normal goods and inferior goods. Normal goods are those goods which the demand tracks along with income. As incomes rise, we demand more of these goods. Leisure travel, we demand more leisure travel as our incomes rise. And we buy bigger houses as our incomes rise. We buy bigger cars, more clothing, more insurance, you name it. Inferior goods go the opposite direction. As our incomes rise, we tend to demand less of them. Generic goods, we tend to demand less generic goods. We tend to demand, but as our incomes fall, we'll demand more of those things like generics and substitutes for what are normal goods, because inferior goods are always substitutes. And they would include things like generics and lower cost substitutes, alternatives, maybe some imported items that are quote unquote knockoff items, not the name brand itself, but maybe something that is analogous to it that does essentially the same thing. Okay. All right. So that does it. I'm about out of time. I think we've got about 10 seconds left. Are there questions for me about anything I've talked about here today? Well, if you do have questions, get with me. Again, I'll try to post the exam as soon as I'm done putting it together. I've started it, but I kind of got short-circuited with my week last week, so I apologize once again. And if you do run into any issues, particularly technical issues in Brightspace, feel free to get with me. Just send me an email, I'll get it. I'm available, and I'll be happy to help. And otherwise, if there are no questions for now, and I look forward to seeing you next week. And I wish you all good luck with the exam.